the North by NorthWest podcast. I'm Matthew Parsons. When you think about photographs, you're probably envisioning realistic images of things that actually exist. That's the whole idea of photography, to point a camera at a real scene and freeze it in time. It's documentation. But Vancouver photographer Dan Jackson has another idea about what photography can do. In his latest exhibit, he's transformed photographs of dull factory interiors into wonderlands of pastel color. Picture a network of ducts and pipes, the kind that are normally grimy silver gray. But Dan has digitally colored every surface in the image with Easter egg vibrancy. In the end, they kind of turn out looking like abstract paintings. When I talked with Dan at Gallery 732, I found out that's exactly the point.
Yeah, that's precisely right. They are a complete departure from the basic idea of photography being a documentation. So the further I could drift away from documentation into exploring being more expressive with the work, that was my ultimate goal.
Why factories?
I wanted a template that I could place these colors over top of, and I could have chosen any number of things to apply this technique. It could have been a sunset, it could have been a beach, it could have been something that we were already familiar with, but I felt that was kind of gilding a lily. I wanted to make something that is utilitarian and fairly banal, but still vaguely familiar to us, and make it purely decorative. Sort of something that goes from being useful to beautifully useless.
And, I mean, there's such geometrical shapes. From a distance, it looks like just sort of a semi-random assemblage of trapezoids and shapes. And was that part of what was attractive about it to you?
That was a byproduct of the process. I really like that that's something that you picked up on. But I approached it from a different angle. So it was merely a byproduct, and once I saw that that was starting to happen, I sort of fell in love with these sort of random shapes and colors and forms. But I didn't know that that was going to actually be the conclusion.
I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the process of making them. So you take the photo, and then what happens?
Yeah, these were two sites that I photographed at the cement factory down in Marpole on the Fraser River, and the other one is the Sunripe factory up in Kelowna. They were essentially documentation at the beginning, and I wanted to make them more interpretive. So I literally went in and hand traced every detail on them and applied a color to each and every object in there and every plane. These two images that start off the show were months and months of work.
How did you settle on a color palette? Because this show is so vibrantly colorful, and you've used these sort of bright pastel shades.
I have some issues with my eyesight where I struggle to perceive 3D in the way other people would perceive it. So a lot of it has to do with complementary colors and trying to manipulate colors that have shorter wavelengths and longer wavelengths and putting them next to each other. So you literally start with one color, add a color next to it, and see how they vibrate, see how they interact, and then you move on to your third color, fourth color, until you get to, 1,200 colors, 1,400 colors. And you can have a color that's fairly dead, but when you put it next to a new color, you can bring it to life.
You mentioned a little bit your issue perceiving three dimensions. I wonder if you could describe how the way that you see the world is a little bit different from the way that somebody with ordinary eyesight might be.
I was born with an eye problem called strabismus, which is fairly common. I think it probably affects about 10%. It's usually diagnosed at a young age, which it was in my case. And over the years, I've gone through a series of attempts to alleviate the condition. What happens is it tends to cause people to have double vision. For me, when they were trying to alleviate the condition with surgeries and corrective lenses, I ended up with some side effects where I perceived three-dimensional wavelengths at the same time. I first discovered it actually walking down the street, and those Canada Post mailboxes. They are blue maple leafs on a red field. So the blue wavelengths were hovering in front of my eyes, and the red was receding, and I was struggling to cope with it. And I think this exhibit is sort of my way of coping and embracing it, I guess, in a way.
So I noticed in one of the factory pictures, there's a bird sitting there. What's with the bird?
Finches are a recurring motif, and I did an exhibit 2 years ago called Space in Bird. They were sort of the jumping off point for me when I started exploring color. If you look at some of these finches, one is painted like a Mondrian painting, and one looks like a Kandinsky, and they just have these incredible palettes on them. And as I was struggling with my vision, seeing them flitting about became something I felt would be a nice motif for me to explore. I sort of used them as a device. So I decided to tie in the two shows together by bringing them in again as sort of a recurring theme.
And of course, there's one very large picture of a finch here.
The large finch, which is the focal point of the show, really speaks to the idea of photography going back and forth between representation and abstraction. So that finch is constructed entirely of elements from the factory pieces. So that finch is itself a fabrication. It's still a photograph, but it's a photograph of something that doesn't exist.
I'm really curious about how you got started making art. Was it photography to begin with, or how did it start for you?
I never actually thought I'd be a photographer. I thought I'd be a painter. For a while, I think I was a little kid and I saw Fantasia, and I wanted to be an animator. But then I realized I just have to sit around and draw all day. And it was interacting with people that attracted me to photography, and I'm not probably as enamored with the medium as other people. I think a beautiful picture is a beautiful picture, and I don't care how you get there. So I don't nerd out when it comes to photography or the equipment that we use or the gear any more than I think a mechanic is excited by the wrench that they use or anything like that. For me, it's if the work looks like paintings, I'm content with that as long as it affects people in a positive way. My real goal right now seems to be that I want to advocate for photography being an expressive art form and conveying to people that photographers have feelings too, and we that when we create images, they ought to be expressive, not just documentation.
So that there can be sort of photography of the inner world as well as photography of the outer world, maybe.
I think so. It's to be able to explore and convey emotions purely through color and shape. I think it's a little unfair that is only the domain, or perceived as only the domain, of the painters and the sculptors and the ceramicists and the filmmakers. I want to be a part of that.
As I was looking at the sort of digital representations of these that I saw before I walked into the actual gallery, I was struck by the idea that so much of what's here is so bright and vibrant and just joyful. And I've sometimes found that in the art world, the experience of joy is sort of underrated somehow. Do you agree with that? And is that part of why you make these choices in colors?
Absolutely. That is precisely what I'm trying to convey. I've had people ask, okay, you've got this problem with your eyesight, and how do you cope with it? And I wanted to embrace it, and I want to encourage other people who may perceive things in a unique way and in a different way to not consider it necessarily a malady, but it can actually be an enhancement because it's a unique way of seeing. It's a different way of seeing. And I think right now, with the political climate, I feel like historically, when things were tough, a lot of art that seemed to resonate with people was actually a departure from that. The 60s there was so much turmoil, and we had Andy Warhol, and we had pop art, and we had work that I think maybe gave people a bit of a respite from it. And the work is joyous. It is happy. Maybe I'm expressing the fact that I'm in a happy place right now. I don't know why, but this seems to be what's coming out of me right now. And when times are relatively peaceful, that's when you will see more activist art happening. So, 10 years ago, things weren't as divisive as they are now. And we saw the emergence of Banksy. And now that we are divisive, I just want people to come in and embrace a new way of seeing and celebrate color and shape and just be content with that.
Well, Dan, thank you so much for inviting me to come in here and see these pictures. I've really enjoyed looking at them, and I'm going to take a closer look now. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for coming.